thank you very much for attending on such a beautiful day. It's gorgeous. I am going to cover the evidentiary aspect, and the first thing I'm going to tell you is I'm not a lawyer. Please, I have lots of people hear evidence of that if I have to get to it, but anything I say has no legal opinion to it, because in Canada, of course, it's illegal to offer legal advice unless you are a lawyer, and I'm not. So I'm going to tell you based on my experiences over the past, it's now 25 years, I guess I'm going to have to update that, that's terrible, and my second career. So I'm going to cover that kind of stuff, but it's not, I'm not giving legal advice. This is just from what I've found from working with a number of clients and working with some of the standards too. So I'm going to cover the Evidence Acts and some of the standards. I'll explain to you what they are and what they say and basically what happens there. We will cover the standards, which are international, national, and industry ones. There are several groups, and I want to differentiate between them. There's some really excellent ones. The past 15 years or so has been really good for records management because we really have some standards to work from now and to use as benchmarks. So that's really helpful to us. I'm going to tell you what the standards say, basically, in terms of the imaging and electronic records, is because I worked on both of them. I was part of the committees. We were talking back a while ago. The imaging standard we put 17 years ago. We developed that thing, and it's been reviewed a couple of times, so it's been around for a while. I'm going to also tell you what I think they mean, which is probably more important than what they say. How do you interpret them? What do you deal with them? And you're going to find that I take a fairly practical approach to things, and I'll cover that as we go through. I'm not terribly prescriptive in what I say, and I try and make you understand what we're trying to do. But also, then I want to cover what you should be saying as you work in your company with people who are worried about imaging and electronic records and how do they sit and where do they go. Remember that we're dealing with the law and we're dealing with courts, and so nothing is ever, totally one way or the other. We're lucky that we do have a precedent to go with. But it's up to individual judges and individuals, and you too. And I'm going to bring that up a number of times. It's really up to you the way you interpret these and bring them forward, and it's up to you if you're the person who has to prove that these records are credible. That's up to you and how you do it. It's not necessarily up to the court. You're the one who's going to have to defend it. First, I want to cover the imaging. From an imaging standpoint, the first thing you should know is that it's not a solution to paper storage. It's not. If you want to simply get rid of paper, and your purpose is to get rid of paper by imaging, you're crazy. It's going to cost you a lot more. I was dealing with a rehab center a while ago who called me and they said they wanted to image their discharged patient records. And so I went down and talked to them and I said, why? First question I always ask is why? Why do you want to do that? They said, well, we like to get rid of the paper and we don't want to have to store the paper. And I just asked them how long did they have a retention policy, and they did. They used it 10 years after discharge. So they destroyed records after 10 years. I said, do you have readmissions? And they said, basically, no. I mean, it's a rehab center, so most people don't get readmitted. They leave horizontal, right? So they die here and they go off. I asked them if they did research with these records. They said, no. No, I mean, we keep them around for a year because we're looking for, release of information, requests, or whatever it happens to be. And after that, we send them off-site, and we just don't keep them. We never refer to them. I said, so why do you want to image them? Here's the paper. Well, I showed them it would cost them, and this is at a very good rate they were getting for imaging, about 23 years to pay back at storage cost. To store the record, they could store the record for 23 years for what it would cost them imaging. And they're only keeping them for 10. So it didn't really make any sense to do that. What it is it supports business processes. That's the real benefit to imaging records, that you can get them and put them online and have people access them. I mean, all the troubles that we've had with paper over the years, all the copies we have to create or the files out and we can't get at it, the inability to do parallel workflows because there's only one copy of a record and so so-and-so has to review it and then go to so-and-so, and although they're really not adding to what the other person did, you could have done a parallel, but there's only one. So you really have to look at imaging to improve business processes, and if you do it right, it really does. I mean, you can create, everybody's into document management. Anybody here have document management systems installed in your corporation? Okay. Your ability to launch workflows, basically by the system knowing it's an invoice and bang, off it goes, and how much it is, and all this kind of stuff, and do all that kind of stuff. It's tremendous, the wonderful things you can do with imaging and indexing, and we're going to see some examples of that a little bit later. But really, that's what you need to do. You need to look at an image system as an imaging as part of a business process improvement. We have a client that, in fact, we work with MES on, I'll talk a little bit later, that they worked in paper and microfilm all the time. We went from that to a system where they scan from the file. And the tremendous improvements that they got were just unbelievable from that. And it wasn't the fact that they were getting rid of paper, it was that they put it in a business process. One of the things you have to worry about and consider all the time is technology obsolescence. And from a records manager standpoint, one of the things we always look at is retention periods for record. If you have a record that is a permanent or long-term retention, one of the things you have to consider is, will we be able to retrieve that document later on? Now, we do have good standards now for image, either TIFF or PDF/A, which is the international standard for image records. People have said, yes, we're going to be able to retrieve that always in the future. You know, I talk to people about WordPerfect files and stuff like that image companies still have, but that is a consideration for you. So you have to think about that kind of thing when you're looking at imaging records. Will we be able to? Because, you know, there's only two storage media that don't require machine interface: paper and microfilm. You know, with microfilm, if you have a light source and large enough, you know, magnifying glass, you can basically read the thing. So everything else that we do have, whether it's a electronic record, completely electronic, or an image record, you need a machine to interface with, and it has to have instructions and all that kind of stuff. So you have to worry and consider that kind of thing. One of the things you should consider is, should we use film, you know, as a backup? You know, Kevin, I'm sure, or his brother Andrew would be willing to talk to you about what that costs extra, but it's a very incremental cost, right, Kevin, to when you're imaging to run microfilm at the same time. I grant you don't want to work for microfilm all the time, but it's a very good, low-cost, long-term storage for image records or whatever you want to do, so that it's there as you want to work from. So you have to consider that, make sure that you don't solve one problem and paint yourself into a corner on another one. Right? We've got it later, we can't get it. You know, you look at some records again, I think those people are from pension, but one of the ones, if you look at pension records, someone comes in, it could be required for 80 some odd years, right? By the time someone comes in and you get beneficiaries and all this kind of stuff paid, what do? You know, kind of thing. So there's a way to deal with it, but you have to consider that, okay? Let's talk a little bit, and again, I'm going to tell you, everywhere except Quebec, we go on precedent, right? We go with what precedent has, and we basically work from that. So the courts, you look to what the courts have. If you want to know about imaging, look towards, the RCMP was the first one. Marcel Roy from the RCMP was part of the group that wrote the standard. And so they took on the task actually of challenging themselves in court to prove that images would be acceptable. And so what they had done was they'd taken all the criminal records that they had on paper, scanned them, imaged them, and destroyed the paper. And so they were producing, when they produced a criminal record in court, they're producing a copy from the image. They didn't bring the image in, but a certified copy from the images. And so they had that challenge in court to prove that they were acceptable. And they were, by following the standard, So that was the first precedent we really had. Criminal records is a pretty damn good one to do, to check. So, and that was back in 1996. So there's been a lot around that. So we do have that. So we have that to play with everywhere there. In Quebec, of course, we go with common law. And again, precedent does come into it a little bit, but basically in Quebec, what you get is that, you know, if it doesn't say it's forbidden, it's not. That's what basically common law says, which is a Catholic Church way of doing things, basically. Me being Catholic, except the Catholic Church forbids everything, and then you just go from there. It doesn't leave any holes. But basically, that's the way it works. So the Evidence Acts do allow now for image records, and they do allow for electronic records to be brought into play. They do say that you can use them and bring them into court, and they may stand as evidentiary value. What we do have is, though, that they talk about this all the time. If there's one little piece of advice I can give you is that do this. The imaging should form part, and this is a quote from all the Evidence Acts, the usual and ordinary course of business. So if you use imaging, the documents that you use as part of your usual course of business, invoice processing, patient records, whatever it happens to be, personnel evaluations, whatever it is, if that's part of your business process, that's the way we normally do work, it lends a lot of credibility to the record, right? And that doesn't matter whether it's paper or image or whatever it happens to be, but if that's what you do, this forms part of our ordinary business. It's not something that's above and beyond. We didn't scan all these records, and that applies to creation of records, use of records, and to disposition of records, most important, because that's not what we're here to talk about. You know, the getting rid of the record should be part of the ordinary course of business too, so you have to do that kind of thing. So look at that. If it's part of your normal business process, then you have said to them, basically, we rely on them. We make decisions based on these kind of things. So you should rely on them too. They should have a lot of weight and credibility to do that. The two that we did have came in, the Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, or whatever you want to pronounce it, that acronym. When it did come in, it was, people focused on the privacy aspect of it a lot because it was a big impact. It came down to all corporations and spread privacy to corporations. But remember, it was Electronic Documents Act. And the stated purpose of that act, the federal one, was to promote electronic commerce. The Liberals at the time said, we need to promote electronic commerce. That's the way Canada's going to progress and really do very, very well. One of the biggest problems people have with electronic commerce, why it's holding it back, is the fact that people don't trust electronic records. We're really worried about once our information gets out in the domains, we have to tighten that down and really crank it down. But it did. It was the document, the act rather, that gave credibility and evidentiary value to electronic records. And when that came into play, we had to start writing electronic records standard too, to really play that. So it was, although people look at the privacy aspect of it, remember its purpose was to bring credibility to electronic records, and it gave, for instance, it said that electronic records of Hansard were legal and all that kind of stuff. It put it in for them. So, and then what it said was that it gave the provinces a time period in which to enact similar legislation, or PIPEDA would come into play. And of course, Ontario did pass the Electronic Commerce Act, which is substantially similar to that, which basically says electronic records, including imaging, are legally acceptable in Canada. All the other provinces have come on board too, and now so we basically, across Canada, there's very, very few differences. There's nothing substantive difference in any of the acts, the Electronic Records Act or the Imaging Evidentiary Standards Act. There is a group that the lawyers put together that tries to come up with common formats for these kind of legislation, and it does follow it. So you basically have allowance in all provinces now in Canada for those evidence acts. And if you want to check, there's a, Carswell has a publication called Records Retention Law and Practice that has a summary of all those. The standards. This was the biggest one, big benefit. The ISO 15489 came out, it started from Australia, which has a really very good federal records management program. Always has had, or not always has had, but had for the past 20 or 25 years, that's kind of been the gold standard. So the International Standards Organization said, well, we need one, and we need a records management standard. So they took the Australian standard, made it global in perspective, and it talks about a records management program, what your program should have, all the way from policies down to individual responsibilities and what people should do. So if you don't have that and you want to do that, because remember, imaging, you know, is an important part of that, is managing the records, obviously, and managing image records. So you should look towards that. You can get it on the International Standards Organization website, and it's a very, very good one. So it helps to be able to look at your program and measure that kind of, your program against this international standard. The first one we developed was the microfilm electronic images as documentary evidence is the full title of it. Again, you can get this from the Canadian General Standards Board. And where this comes into play is that the Evidence Acts say that basically in trying to get your documents produced into court and as evidentiary value to get them, to put some weight behind them, it says that you can, I'm paraphrasing a bit, you can call in national standards to prove the credibility of your program, right? Now, you can call them in to support your program, or someone could call them in to defeat the program, right? So what I'm saying is, if you want to prove that your records are credible, you can say, well, we've done it in accordance with the national standard, we measure that, and it's good. If I want to prove that your records aren't credible, and you haven't followed the standard, I can put it against you too, right? I mean, if I want to get your records thrown out in court, I can say, well, there's a national standard. How do you measure up against that national standard? You're not doing this, you're not doing that. I don't think your records are credible. And so we can do that. So be careful of that. I'm going to go into this a little bit further detail on what the standard is. Then we did in 2005, we wrote the electronic record standard. The microfilm standard took us about 18 months to write. It was a committee formed of this Canadian General Standards Board requires people within the industry, vendors, users, and consultants to form a group. There was a prescriptive way that the formation of the group. It took us about 18 months to write that one. It took us 6 years to write the electronic record standard. And we didn't include electronic signatures in it, which would have cost us another 5 or 6 years. It was much more complicated, but we took the standard format. And it has been in place since 2005. And it follows the same kind of format. There are industry standards too. If you should always look to what your industry says about imaging. A lot of them have produced, the Canadian Banking Association, Insurance Bureau of Canada has produced them, CLHIA, the Life and Health Insurance Association has produced guidelines for imaging. And so you can look towards those. they don't take precedence over the national standard, obviously, but if there is a guideline, and it's probably more applicable, well, it is more applicable to you, it's more defined and detailed in what you should do based on your particular industry. So if you're in insurance as opposed to healthcare, it tells you what to do for that particular thing. So you should look towards those organizations and make sure that they do have those. If you do have them, that you follow them. Microfilm and electronic documents, images as documentary evidence. When we started on that, Ray Grapey, who was at the time with Coopers and Library, I don't know where he is now, he came out, I got to give him a lot of credit, because he said to us, look, what we can't do, this committee, what we can't do is make it prescriptive. We can't say this is how you have to do things, because technology changes all the time. What we have to do is say this is what you want to be able to prove. This is what you want to achieve. How you do it is up to you. And so what the standard does is it sets out guidelines for use, and it sets out objectives. So it says we have to be able to, you have to be able to prove this kind of thing. I'll cover some of those as we go through the more important ones. We don't tell you how to do it. We don't. It's entirely up to you how you do it. Because again, like I said, you're the one who's going to have to sit up on the judge, on the bench rather, the witness stand. This is the way we did it. This is the way, and this is good, and get it measured. We don't have to tell you how to do that. And you know what we said, we were talking at the back, when we first started 17 years ago, 1993, document scanners weren't very good at picking up double feeds. They did it all the time. So we wrote into the thing, and it's still a valid one, that you have to prove completeness of capture. That if you had 100 documents going through, you have to have 100 at the other end. And how did you do that? Well, you counted. Do you have to do that now? No. Really, but it's up to you. But in any case, so the technology has improved to the point where double feeds will be picked up just like that from good scanning. It's not, MFU, multifunction unit, but they will. So we did that, and we wrote guidelines for business use. We said this is the way it has to go in terms of the business. And notice I say guidelines. We did guidelines for court, what you have to be able to do. And there are, one of the things we wrote in there, Ken Chase, who's a lawyer who deals in records management and evidentiary value, believe it or not, there is a lawyer who deals with records management. He wrote a lot of instructions about how to interpret this and how to deal with it. So what you need to do and what you may run across in court, and how to be able to set yourself up for that. So that was very good. We did that kind of stuff and put it. It is still very valid for that. So this is what you may have to do. We talked about weight as opposed to evidentiary value in the whole thing. And then we provided the benchmark for evaluation, which is again these objectives that we have. So let's look at some of those. The objectives are specified, what you want to achieve. As I said, it's not. We don't go down further from that. The techniques are not specified. It's at the discretion of the organization. So you have to, and this is where you have to look, and it's risk management. Right? You have to look at how closely you want to put all this stuff in. But there were 12 control objectives put in. For instance, I mentioned completeness of capture is one thing. You know, if you have to somehow be able to make sure that we did capture all the documents. That also talks about both sides of the document. How many people here are, by the way, scanning using multifunction unit photocopiers and stuff? I forget, don't put your I'm going to shoot that down in about 2 seconds. Not a good idea. I mean, it depends upon how you want to use your document. Because if you just simply want to use it for convenience and as a copy, that's fine. Because until you destroy the source document, until you destroy the original record, that's all you have. The image is simply the copy. That has no more value than a photocopy on paper. I mean, that's basically what you're creating. But one of the things you want to do all the time, for instance, is you want to do double-sided scanning, right? How are you going to prove, if you do single-sided scanning, which you do normally on a multifunction unit, a lot of people do that anyways, all our documents are single-sided. You get into court and I say, well, wait a second. On page 13, I wrote a little note in the back to you saying, don't do this anymore. Where is it? How can you prove it's not there, right? Unless you do double-sided scanning. Now, the problem with double-sided scanning is that if you then present it to people, every single image, every second image rather, is blank. And it really ticks you off to have to go, blank. So what you do is you write it into the software will write it in to drop those off. Anything below a certain value, like 5K or image size or whatever, I don't know, I use the same kind of thing, the value, yeah. So you say to it, anything below, any page that we image in is below 5K or something, we're going to drop it off to present it to the user. It's still in the database. Okay, you can keep it in the database, which you want, but that's what we recommend. Keep it in the database, but don't present it to the user. So that the user gets the best of both worlds, but basically, if someone challenges, you can go back and say it. The other side was blank. Here it is. Here's the front. Here's the back. Here's the front. Here's the back. Here's the front. Here's the back. And there's nothing on the back. You got to worry about that kind of stuff. The accuracy of it as you put it through. Are the images legible or not? Again, your process can determine that. If you scan at the beginning of a process and you use those images in the process, you know, like you scan the mailroom and then put it through for input, the fact that it's being used in business processing will tell you whether the image quality is good or not, right? I mean, you will check it on scanning. You'll do that definitely on scanning. But if people also use it, it can shorten the time that you have to want to keep the source documents before you destroy them, because you're getting good verification on that too. Authorization is big. Are the documents that you're scanning in authorized? And one of the things that you have to do is identify in your program, in your policy, which documents you're going to image, which documents you're going to rely on the image record rather than the paper record, because you're not going to image all of them. There's some you're not going to bother to do that, so you have to do that. Is the program actually authorized or not? Maintenance of the documents. One of the things people don't do often is, well, we dealt with a client that was imaging records and then moving into a lifeline system. So they were using Kofax Ascent Capture to scan the documents in, but it was handed over to the system. And so we said to them, how do we know the system got it? You know, we turned 20 over, we have to make sure that 20 went into the system. It's not just that we captured, that's not the end of the process. We have to make sure that the open text system, the lifeline system, grabbed it and pulled it in. So you have to make sure of that too. What it does with it afterwards is not a problem, but what if it got dropped? You know, I said to them, that's the image equivalent of the guy who drops a piece of paper as he's pushing mail cart around and drops it in the garbage, right? Never got there. So you have to make sure of that. The image capture, again, quality of it and everything, the conversion of it from that format into PDFA or TIFF or whatever you're going to do to make sure it's there, or to bring it into the system, make sure that that's good. And indexing is extremely important. How are you going to retrieve it? Again, it's a simple principle. We said one of the major things you have to be able to prove is you can get the images back when you scan them. We just can't drop them in, so you have to make sure the indexing is accurate. And that is the one area where people miss the most, is that you have to audit the indexing. In fact, where the MFUs don't come into play very well is that basically the standard demands that two people be involved in the capture and indexing. It's based on the fact that you can't audit your own work, right? That's a standard principle. People can't audit their own work. So what we say is that two people should be involved. They can rotate back and forth, but basically one person should be involved in the imaging, check the quality of it, make sure that a normal index is put in, put it over to someone else who then will review that index and the images, maybe count whatever has to be done, add some more indexing, and then they commit it to the system. Okay? Simply because if you index it to the wrong number, count number, yeah, we can check back with audit trails, but we may not be able to find it. So there has to be two people involved. And most places I've got, in fact, what every place I'm going to do audits, they don't do that. And they don't think about it. It's very easy to do, very easy to implement and do that. So you need to make sure of that. Evidentiary controls, audit trails are extremely important. The good thing is software will do all of those for you. Who did it, when, what system was it done on? You know, you have to it has to be done by people who are competent and qualified. You know, the days of calling, you know, getting your kids in over the weekend, your teenage kids in over the weekend to do the imaging or the microfilming, whatever, they're gone. I mean, you can't do that. They have to be qualified to do that kind of thing. You have to make sure, so the system will log in, who did it, what machine it was done. You may have to be able to prove that the machine was operating properly. They'll talk to you about how often you have to calibrate scanners and stuff, and that's gone way down from what it used to be. People used to do it daily and stuff. Anyway, you have to make sure that's done. But the audit trail will capture all that. Effective and continuous operations, so that the operation is normal and that it's part of the daily process, so that it goes on through the whole thing. And then disposal. When you dispose of the records, because remember I said, the best evidence rules, and again, I'm not a lawyer or a judge, best evidence rules say if you have the source documents still available, that's the one you may be required to produce in the court. That the image is only a copy, just as if it was paper or photocopy. So if you're going to get rid of the records, you need to make sure that you have a purpose, a policy that states you're going to get rid of them, and that you do it properly as part of the ordinary course of business. Legal points, quotation marks, purpose and authority of the program. Again, a big thing that people fall down on is they'll do imaging and they have no policy that approves it. Right? Just as you should have a policy that approves destruction of records, particularly with image records, if you don't have a policy that says it is a policy of this company to take the source documents, scan them, destroy the paper records, and then rely on the image record for evidentiary purposes, You're not meeting, it's a first thing in both the image and electronic standards, that you have to have a policy that approves the program and defines what the program should be. So you need to have that in place or you're going to miss an awful lot. Consistency of operations and methods. It should be, again, just part of what you normally do, that you're not inconsistent. In fact, we'll cover it in a bit, but if you're imaging some records and not others, you can be asked why. Why are you doing that? A lot of places will say, anything that's signed we don't want to image. Why? There's nothing specifically precluding that. Why do you want to do that? Well, because the image, the signature is a very valuable record. Well, so is the other part of the contract. I'm sorry, but you know, it's, keeping the last page might not be. So you need to make sure of that. Precedent, again, there is lots of precedent for image records, and you can get that. There's no reason why not, it should not be accepted in court. It's been around for 17 years now, so that's not a big deal. Be practical. Above all things, be practical. People go in and will go in and do an audit, and they say, well, oh, no, geez, we've been scanning for 10 years. What do we do with all the records we've automatically scanned? We've just done. Are they no good? You know, we've had a single person doing it, we're using photocopiers. What do we do about that? Well, my approach, and it's simply my approach to that, is declare that you've got a problem. I mean, you don't want to go back and rescan all that stuff. Probably you don't have the source records. If you had to scan, you scan for what you've already gotten. That's already in question whether that was, you know, if you're going to scan the images again, if they're no good in the first place, then your copy of it's no good anyway. So declare, we've got a problem here. We have a problem, we understand we have a problem, we think that they're good, we think our program is credible. Sure, it wasn't in accordance with the standard, we weren't aware of the standard, we're moving forward now, and just do it, right? What's the problem? You're faced with that issue, why not be upfront and declare it? We have a problem here. We think there's a problem. We still think that they're credible, we've been using them and everything, but now we're switching to the standard. So what do you do about this? I think just do it. How much scrutiny is enough? It's totally, absolutely, and completely up to you. Completeness of capture, for instance. People would typically, at the beginning of the program, your confidence has to be there. Just like ATMs when they first came in. I kept every bloody slip. I did. My dad was a banker, right? So at the end of the month, I'd go through and I'd do this and do, you know, now I don't even ask for a receipt on stuff. I just don't, you know, my confidence level is extremely high with them, right? That's right. Sorry, I heard me. So the same thing with your program. At first, you may want to do that because you've got to get comfortable with it. You've got to make sure that you're comfortable with it. What after, you know, a month, whatever it is, you slack off. So maybe you do every third batch or every fourth batch or 10th batch or whatever. So it's up to you. You've got to be able to have that. But your confidence is going to build in the system because the equipment is extremely good and your people will be trained very, very well. So that, again, is entirely up to you. When can I destroy the records? You should state a minimum time. But it'll depend upon where you use it in the process. So if you do up front, like I said, and it's part of the business process, so those documents are reviewed to approve a claim or rule somebody in a pension plan, whatever, you can shorten that time frame because those documents have been reviewed for quality. Although, like I said, they were reviewed at least twice during the process, the imaging process by 2 different people. But still, if you use it in part of the whole thing, then people can look at that and see. If you use it as an after the process thing, you know, we process the claim and then we scan it. First of all, I question we do that, but in any case, if you do that, then you may want to keep it longer because they will not be used, they will not be reviewed as often, so you may want to look at longer. But you should set a minimum period of time, and every place I've been, we've never set anything lower than 30 days. So you keep the source document around for 30 days and then destroy it. But again, remember that you do have to have a policy that authorizes the destruction of those documents in reliance on the image record. Keep some originals and destroy others? No. Don't do it. Because like I said before, you call into question by your own actions the credibility of your program, right? We had a client, and I was going to case study, I'm going to cover it now, but basically this client that we did with the pension organization, their insurer for the benefits program said we will not accept, we want a beneficiary designation form, the original, because it's signed. So, you know what we said? Fine, we'll send them to you. We're going to scan them, we rely on them, and you want to keep them? Fine. Here's a box of beneficiary designations. You can store them because we have no problem with the whole thing. And so consistency is extremely important because, again, you know, you don't want to leave the opening there for someone to do that. Electronic Records was formed in 1999, and in 2005 we finally passed that. Same type of composure for committees as 1993, 6 years. And the impetus was the Electronic Documents Act. As soon as it was coming out, we had to start. It didn't go out until 2002, but we started ahead of time to get that kind of thing in place. we need to have some standards. There's a lot more detail in the electronic record standard because it goes into all kinds of, the definition section alone is longer than the whole microfilm standard because there was all kinds of things we had to bring out. But it again, is not prescriptive in what you have to do, it's what you're trying to achieve. There is one. I tell people when we're dealing with records management that the media does not matter. The medium that you store it on does not matter. The retention does not typically say, you know, you can keep it for 2 years on paper and 6 years for an image or whatever. It says you have to keep it for so long, whatever medium you choose, except for, of course, our good friends at Revenue Canada, who like to be different than everybody else and say that you have to keep computer records, which everybody, I don't know anybody that does counting manually anymore, of any sense, but if you produce them electronically, you have to keep them in electronic or readable format. You want a copy of the paper records that's been kept. So if you print a copy of your journals and ledgers and all this kind of stuff, you still have to have it in electronic format. By the way, that's the only paper I have in my company, is my journal and ledgers, because I use an old accounting program. I have no paper for anything else. I just rely on image and electronic records for the whole thing. I never want to be the shoeless cobbler's kid, right? So if I'm talking about going to electronic records, I want to rely on them totally the other way. So watch this one because you do have to have that electronic records. So what should you be saying? First of all, do that one. Make sure people understand that you're not giving legal advice, that you are talking to people based on what experiences are. Talk to them about the issues that they need to consider. Because again, we're not being prescriptive, so you have to say to them, you know, if you want this, how do we know that these records are credible? How do we know that we captured all this stuff? How do we know that the quality of the images are the best they possibly can be? How do we deal with things where you get a poor quality image, poor quality original document in? Because we don't want people going back and forth. So can we stamp that document with a little stamp that says poor quality original? So that people know when they look at it, this is the best we're going to get. What can we do? Does that change? Does that change the document itself or not? These kind of things you need to look at and work from. There are risks in every deletion of original historical record. You're taking a risk. You are. You're definitely taking, because it may not prove in court. Or you're going to get a judge who's got a bad day and doesn't like what you're doing or whatever. So there is some risk involved, but you can minimize the risk by following the standards and being practical. It's mitigating, right? That's all you have to do. You're looking at it, you're trying to solve a process, you're trying to save a lot of money, which you can't do if you image up front, but there is some risk involved and you're never going to get rid of all of it. But there's a lot of risk with paper. In fact, I think there's more risk with paper. The nice thing about imaging systems or document management systems is that the audit trail is incredible. You know, you can set the audit trail for every keystroke if you wanted to, but basically you can look at, you know, this person went in at this time, they looked at this document, they did this to it, which you can't with paper. You know, you can't. How can you tell if you gave someone a file and they removed page 126 or changed page 126? It's hard to do. Minimize risk with a quality program conducted by qualified personnel. That's the big thing. So make sure your program is very good in that respect. Solve business problems, but consider the long-term implications of doing that in terms of retention and technology obsolescence. So you need to make sure of that. Again, don't paint yourself into one corner by solving another one. That's the only prescriptive advertisement you're going to get, but anyway. Okay. The case study I talked about was a financial organization. We did this with MES, and the guys were absolutely fantastic. They've been their client before, but it was a financial organization, was a pension organization, transactionally based. And what they looked at was simply the transaction of everything dealing with members and pensioners, bringing them in. Everything from enrollment to payment of claims and everything. It wasn't, you know, their accounting records, it wasn't their board minutes, all this kind of stuff. They started with the transactional, which is absolutely fantastic. They implemented open text live line system in there for the whole thing. They were working in paper microfilm. What they would do is basically, after a process was finished and was produced in paper or managed in paper, they would go back to the records room, who would then send it off to MES. They would microfilm it, they bring it back, cut the film, load it into a jacket system, and maintain a file for the people. Next time something happened with that person, they'd pull a copy of the dies, a copy of the film, put it in the folder on one side, send it to the floor with any paper that would come in. They'd process it. When it was finished, it came back. They'd take the film, put it back, take the new paper, send it off, get it imaged, or get it microfilm back in. Okay, so paper, microfilm, paper, microfilm, paper, microfilm. Slow process, very much so. Very effective. They had 3 copies at least, I think, of the microfilm, so their disaster recovery was not going to be a problem, except for the paper they had on the board. And remember, sometimes this could take up to 2 years to process something, right? Some of the things, you know, beneficiary changes or whatever, where there's multiple marriages involved and multiple, you know, it could take a long time. So their exposure to a fire was huge. huge. If they ever had a fire, they would lose all those documents. Some of them were marriage certificates, birth certificates, you know what I mean? So they wanted to go to the system. So they went from that on a weekend. They had this huge disaster exposure to loss of paper. Cumbersome system for tracking the documents. They could do it, but you know they were in microfilm. They had a system that you could know where things were supposedly, but they got passed around the office quite often and didn't really get done. Many disparate systems. They had one for their accounting system, one for enrollment, one for, there was no clear picture of anything. So when anybody called in, it was typical to say, I'll get back to you in a couple of days with an answer to that, which was a big problem, obviously, for pensioners, particularly for pensioners, or someone looking, anticipating what's my pension if I go at a certain time and all this kind of stuff. So they couldn't really do that. And answering simple questions took a very long time for them. So what they did was they implemented imaging at the mailroom. All stuff coming in, members and pensioners, was scanned. The records staff, absolutely fantastic. Again, they were basically custodians of microfilm. That's what they were before. They went from that to scanning all these documents and prepping them, scanning them in, and indexing them, using some of this the information they had learned through osmosis about the documents and everything to creating and launching workflows. And so they did a wonderful thing. So they implemented that at the mailroom. They fed images and indexes to the document management system, and it generated automatic workflows. If there was a change of beneficiary, it went into the system. It went and did this way as opposed to an enrollment, as opposed to whatever it had to be. And it automatically flowed in through the system and went to the proper people, which was tremendous. The backfile scanned all paper and microfilm. 8 million or 18 million? 18 million images on microfilm alone. You guys converted, and thousands of files that we had to convert on a weekend. Because we had to get the paper that was in process and get it in ready for, it was Tuesday morning. They gave us a Monday. They gave it an artificial long weekend. They destroyed the paper eventually, but kept the film. They had the film, right? So why get rid of it? It was good, and I think they're even storing a copy of it at MAS. Tremendous improvement in customer service, as you can imagine. People were able to respond right away to the people. And because of this, there were also pushback to the people through the web. People can get in and do their own pension calculation. What if? They can do their own what ifs because the information is there. All that information is in the system. They can change their own beneficiary designation because the insurance company doesn't like that, but they can change their address. All this stuff that used to have to be done, on paper is now done through a process. And the people have that information. They can, all the people have 2 screens, so they can look at their unique system that they call Precedent, and they can look at the images at the same time and answer questions right away. It's absolutely fantastic. But they had no staff reductions for 2 years. Remember that it's a process. It's a learning process. It takes a while to do. You got to get things up and running. Oftentimes what happened was work changed. There was a reallocation of work. They just went through a huge buyback system. The government opened up periods of time, so there was thousands of people applying to buy pension time by previous service, and they were able to handle that through the work in the mailroom. So it was really good. One document type retained in paper, and that was that beneficiary designation. And I don't know what the insurance companies did with them, but they get them, and like I said, it was up to them. One of the reasons we did that, we didn't want to store it, but we didn't want to be inconsistent also in how we were dealing with stuff and saying that we want to keep these beneficiary designations because there's something. The interesting point is that insurance company, who will go unnamed, has a very progressive imaging program and has had it for many years. And it was really interesting that they were doing it and destroying paper internally, but they wouldn't allow one of their clients to do that. They wanted the original, so I don't know what they're doing with that as they go on. So basically, to sum up then, what you want to do, it's a very cost-effective solution to business process issues. Remember that. You're trying to make things run cheaper, faster, better. The images are legal if you follow the standards. There's lots of precedent for it, so don't be afraid to put your head on that one. The electronic records are also legal if you comply with the standard, and be practical. The standards outline objectives, not procedures, and you have to look at it from that format. So they're laid out as control objectives, and then how you interpret them and deal with them is that way. Obviously, then be consistent. Inconsistency in how you deal with things, whether it's imaging or destruction of records or whatever it is, can cause you terrible problems. Particularly if you destroy it, it's really comes up to play in destruction of records. But anything you can do, the more consistent you are across the whole program, the lot more credibility you have. Thank you.